Hi, first grade friends. I'm excited to read with you guys today. This is the story that we're going to be focusing on this week, and it's called A Lost Button from Frog and Toad Are Friends. The author is Arnold Lobel. I'm excited that we're reading this story this week because Mrs. Maris used to read Frog and Toad all the time when she was little, and I really like their stories. I think they are cool, they have fun together, and they do lots of fun adventures. So before we get started on A Lost Button, I want you guys to stop and think if you think this is fiction or nonfiction. Okay, get it in your head. If you're thinking fiction, you were correct. So this is fiction, which means it's a made-up story. But there are different kinds of fiction stories, and this one specifically is called fantasy. Now, fantasy are like fairy tales and things like that. So a lot of times fantasy may have talking animals doing things that people do. And fantasy may have characters going on adventures and lots of different things like that. So I want you guys to listen while I read A Lost Button from Frog and Toad Are Friends and think about why you think this story might be fantasy, okay? So our essential question for while we're reading is, how do we classify and categorize things? Read about what happens when Toad loses his button. Okay, let me move myself. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." "Don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here is your button," cried Frog. "That's not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button is white." Toad put the black button into his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button? I found one." "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That's not my button," cried Toad. "That button is small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. "I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here is one that I just found." "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button was round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There, on the floor, he saw his white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad. "It was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." Toad took all the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. And that is the end A Frog and Toad, A Lost Button. So I hope you guys enjoyed that story. Okay, you're going to work in your Wonders workbook on pages 212 to 213. I'm going to say bye for now and happy learning, first graders.